So good evening and welcome to the Academy. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you tonight to this evening's Nina Maria Gorrison lecture, Victims in the Shadow of Conflict, which will be delivered by Noam Lupu, who is associate professor of political science at Vanderbilt. Just a word first about the fellowship. The Nina Maria Gorrison Fellowship was inaugurated in 2011. It's named after the longtime Academy trustee, Nina von Maltzahn. Her maiden name was Nina Maria Gorrison. Nina was, as I said, a longtime Academy trustee. She was one of the granddaughters of Hans Arnold, in whose house we find ourselves this evening. And she was an absolutely sparkling individual who passed away almost exactly 2 years ago. Nina was really one of the central people in the Academy family, and she grew up in New York after her parents had to flee the Nazis. She studied in Switzerland. She acquired her last name, a renowned one in Germany, when she married Lothar von Maltzahn in 1990. She was an extraordinary philanthropist with wide-ranging interests. She loved music and was a longtime supporter and, in fact, chairwoman of the board of the Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. Perhaps her greatest project was in Uruguay, so a little appropriate for a Latin Americanist, where she created a school that was school, healthcare, child care center, family care center for underprivileged children. It's quite a remarkable endeavor. And she was also a really devoted supporter of the American Academy. Even when she was ill in her late years, she would come and hide out in the back seats of this room to hear lectures or come to the presentation of the fellows, which she underwrote for many, many years. We lost her way too soon. She was really a great friend of the Academy. I should also add that she was a longtime chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, which was not something that most of our trustees were rushing to take over. But she had an incredible eye, and much of the decoration and the architecture and the furnishings around the Academy are due to Nina. So I'm pleased that we have our Nina Maria Gorrison lecture tonight, because we have just gotten over the 25th anniversary gala in New York, and it has reminded us how really essential to our existence the Arnold family has been, and we feel very much indebted to them. And speaking of families, we're delighted to have the Lupu family here tonight in such great numbers. Thank you for coming out, guys. You're very good sons. My sons never would sit still for one of my talks. We can talk about that more later. So, and to Noam's father, it's a pleasure that you came all this way. So, as I mentioned, Noam is on the faculty at Vanderbilt. He is also the associate director of the Latin American Public Opinion Project at Vanderbilt, and he is affiliated with the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies, as well as the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, and finally the Data Science Institute. Do you have enough affiliations there, I asked you? Before joining Vanderbilt, Noam taught at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he was a visiting professorship at Torquato Di Tella University in Argentina. He is himself part Argentinian, but I found out he is even more Chilean. So that's what your father told me. So anyway, he holds degrees, including a PhD from Princeton and an MA from the University of Chicago. He's published 2 books, Campaigns and Voters in Developing Democracies, Argentina in Comparative Politics, and Party Brands in Crisis, Partisanship, Brand Dilution, and the Breakdown of Political Parties in Latin America. And maybe in the Q&A you can tell us a little bit about the breakdown of political parties in America. He has been published in all the right places. I learned about these during my time at Dartmouth College, the American Journal of Political Science, American Political Science Review, or APSR to those in the know, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Politics, and World Politics, among many others. His work has been supported by the Inter-American Development Bank and USAID. He received the 2021 Theta Scotchbowl Prize for Emerging Scholars from the Comparative Politics section of the American Political Science Association. So today, Noam will present his current research, which he is conducting together with Leonid Pesachen. Yeah, this is a test. Associate Professor of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi, a place that I can pronounce easily, all too easily. They examine whether political violence may have a lasting legacy on identities, attitudes, and the behaviors of victims, their families, and especially their descendants. And I just want to say that one of the things as a ignorant government stiff that I took away from my time working at Dartmouth was just the extraordinary expansion of the different disciplines in the social sciences to cover more and more interesting subjects that you never thought that they would touch. In fact, it's getting harder and harder to tell the social sciences apart because, economists are talking about, deaths of desperation. Other political scientists are talking about inherited attitudes having to do with traumas of war. Anyway, it's completely fascinating stuff. It's an amazing period in the social sciences, given what people are taking on and the absolutely fascinating work that they are doing. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Noam. I just want to say that his lecture will last about 30, 35 minutes. If you are here, you know how to ask a question. If you are joining us virtually, type your question in the Q&A of the Zoom platform. Someday that will not need to be repeated. Anyway, it's wonderful to have you all here, and Noam, it's a pleasure to give the podium to you.
Oh, Dan, you grabbed my notes.
You shouldn't have left them there.
I did. I have to say, I had a feeling that would happen as I watched him tuck his papers underneath mine. Thanks so much, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I also want to thank my fellow fellows for being here and for creating such a wonderful community here at the Academy. It's really been a privilege to be a fellow with everybody here. And also a privilege to be here with the amazing staff at the Academy. Really, they've just made us, me and the rest of my family, feel so welcome here. It's been fantastic. I want, because as Dan mentioned, my wife and kids are here, I want to also take the opportunity to thank them. As you'll see when I talk a little bit more about this research, they have been incredibly patient with my long absences from home to be able to do the work that I'm going to talk about today. So I want to take that opportunity. As Dan mentioned, this is all sort of collaborative work with Leo Peisakin, and I just wanted to mention him because if there's anything here that you don't like, it is absolutely something that he came up with, so you can take it up with him. No? Yeah. I want to start talking, as I just was, about my family, and start just mentioning these were my maternal grandparents, my mom's parents. And my grandmother here was born in, so both these grandparents were born in Poland in the early 1920s. My grandmother was born in this little town just northwest of Warsaw. My grandparents both left their towns. My grandfather came from a town sort of near Lublin, if you know your Polish geography. Both of them left in 1939 after the Germany invaded Poland and moved sort of continuously east into the Soviet Union as the war progressed. They survived in the Soviet Union and had my uncle there, and then eventually made their way to Argentina, as Dan mentioned. In the late 1990s, I became involved with an effort to sort of reconsecrate the Jewish cemetery of Gombin, the town that my grandmother was born in. The cemetery plot continued to exist, and I organized a trip where we went back to this town with my grandmother. The plot was still there, and there were still tombstones around, but they were all fallen, and we organized a reconsecration and a monument that still exists there. We organized a return trip in 1999 where lots of, some survivors from Gombin went, but many, many children of survivors and also grandchildren of survivors went, as I did and one of my cousins did as well. When we came back, one of the children of survivors, Minna Packer, decided she wanted to create a documentary film about the history of the town, the village, but also the sort of return of the second and third generation and what this means and how they think about the issues associated with sort of memory within families and monuments and memorializing. And that documentary film that I was also involved with is titled Back to Gombin. And I want to just show you a short clip from that film because I think this is sort of a section of the film that deals with the second generation and kind of how they're thinking about this moment. And again, this is the late 90s.
Entire lives.
As a young child in the 5th and 6th grade, thinking to myself, how would I feel if 90% of my family was suddenly gone? How does one continue? The emphasis in our family was to work and move ahead and leave the other memories behind, but other things are probably left behind as well.
All I've experienced is the hollowness of my parents, the vacuum of pain that's unspoken. And only now, because they're in their 80s, are they starting to talk about it. And yikes, it's a little late.
And sometimes my father would start screaming at night. I mean, shrieking. He'd be dreaming. At one point, I remember he was doing it very frequently, like maybe once a week for like 6 months or so. And I used to hear him shriek. It was very horrifying. So that kind of affected me, and very strangely, it got into me, and I started doing the same thing years later in life, where I would wake up screaming.
I never told my kids when they were younger, because I wanted to raise them normal kids. I didn't want them to pay for the time I suffered, or we as Jews suffered.
When I was very young, I found the photos that are now in the back of one of those photo albums, and I guess I must have been about 6. And my dad yelled at me. And I saw pictures of the hangings and the ovens, and he instantly grabbed the photo album out of my hands and said, I don't want you to see that. And at the time, I didn't really know what it was. I didn't know what it was associated with. But it never left my head.
He got life. We got one life. He's got his wife, he's got his kids, he's got his sisters, he's got his father now. But I had them. But I had another life. I had 2 lives. And I could not live one without the other. I could never forget them.
My father, there just wasn't a minute in his life that you didn't feel it radiating from him, the sadness, the loneliness. And when I was in Cambodia, I really thought if I could bring back some of his family, maybe he'll rest in peace. So that's what I did. Every place we went where there was another place of killing, I tried to bring home a little piece, since we don't really know where his family went. One's from Gambin, one's from Filmo, and one from Conan.
From Conan?
Yeah. Gonna spread the dirt down and put the rocks up there, and hope it helps.
My parents worked very hard and wanted everything for the children. So I was thinking how they did everything for us, and here I am alive and could not do anything to them. So I was really very sad when I came back to Gambin.
You don't sleep, you dream. I fell out from the bed hundreds of times. It's a very big struggle to go around what we went through.
I've heard other people say growing up in homes of alcoholics, like they know they're not supposed to talk about what happens. You know, as an adult, I think, well, maybe it would have been healing if we could have talked about it. But as children, you just knew that that wasn't something we could do.
My father had a tragic ending. My father committed suicide. In the last year of his life, his nightmares were getting stronger and stronger. He distrusted everybody, accused my mother of different things. He was very unsure of himself. And it was...
Sorry, I cut him off. He said shortly thereafter he ended his life. This is, an instance of the kind of thing that I think psychologists know a lot about, the intergenerational transmission of trauma. There's quite a lot of research on this in psychology. A lot of it has to do with Holocaust survivors and descendants of Holocaust survivors, but also Vietnam veterans in the United States. There's a lot of research on this transmission of PTSD. What there's a lot less of is an understanding of what this kind of experience and what this kind of trauma, how it shapes political attitudes or politics more generally. And that's where Leo and I are trying to contribute. This is a large kind of book-length project, and I want to sort of give you a sense of what we're trying to do. I won't rehearse everything that's in there, but I want to give you kind of a sense of what we're trying to argue. The first thing that we're trying to argue is that political violence leaves lasting political legacies. That is, at the very sort of micro level, violence shapes how people think about themselves politically and how they identify with different groups. Violence leaves those kinds of legacies on identities, and then those identities that are shaped by violence get transmitted to children and grandchildren of victims in the same way that political identities outside of violence are transmitted from parents to children, right? So in that way, they can have this kind of lasting effects through socialization. At the same time, we want to argue that this doesn't always happen. As Dan mentioned, there is this kind of boom moment in political science of studying historical legacies. It's like political scientists and economists suddenly discovered that there's such a thing as history. But this doesn't always happen, right? There isn't always this lasting legacy of political violence. And so something we want to dig into is what kinds of contexts generate these kind of lasting effects. There are lots of things that one could think about in terms of that context. The things that we are focusing on are two things, and you'll see this come up when I talk about some of the cases that we're looking at. One is ethnic targeting, right? So when violence is directed at someone because of their membership in an ethnic group, not because of anything in particular that they did, then that creates the kind of heightened anxiety that is going to lead people to kind of retreat into their group identity, right? That's sort of the first part of the argument. The other is that there has to be a sort of sense and attribution of the blame for who is perpetrating violence. There has to be a sense that that perpetrator is someone outside the ethnic group, right? Because if the violence is being perpetrated by other members of your ethnic group, then you don't necessarily sort of retreat into that ethnic identity. Being a member of that ethnic group doesn't no longer sort of feel safe, like a sort of safe haven from the anxiety that the trauma creates. So in contrast, when the perpetrator is sort of a member of an out-group, then kind of retreating into your ethnic group makes people feel sort of a sense of community, a sense of security in the face of violence. So you'll see how this plays out in some of these cases. And then finally, one thing that's been very striking for us, we didn't sort of set out to make this sort of a central feature of this project. But one thing that has been incredibly striking is that individual experiences in conflict settings, when people experience violence, I don't know if often, but sometimes don't correspond to the way that we sort of generate grand narratives about conflicts. And I'll leave it there, but give you an example of this when we get to some of the cases. So these are the cases that we look at in the book. They span a sort of wide range of regions of the world and countries of the world. They mostly focus on sort of three conflict periods. The end of World War II, 44, 45. I put Ukraine and Russia because this is Crimea, and Crimea has shifted hands in the last decade. Guatemala and Cambodia. Now, why these particular cases? Well, there are several things that these cases sort of provide. Unfortunately, the universe of cases of political violence is enormous. So we could have picked from a wide variety of cases, but there's a set of reasons that these particular cases make sense for us to study. One is that the conflicts have ended, right? And so that's important because if we want to know what the effects of violence are on the descendants of victims, separate from any experience that those descendants might have themselves with violence, then it needs to be a conflict that's ended and that the descendants of the victims are no longer personally experiencing violence, right? That's the way that we can sort of tie the ancestor violence to the identities and attitudes of the descendants. The other is that we're looking at cases, or one other, is that we're looking at cases where violence is mostly indiscriminate. And that's important because if we want to know what the effect of violence is on ethnic identities or group identities, then it needs to be the case that you weren't victimized because of your ethnic identity or because you have a particularly strong ethnic identity or because you're a leader among your community, but essentially for indiscriminate reasons or random reasons, right? If violence is sort of selectively targeted at people who already identify very strongly with their group, then we can't sort of distinguish the effect of violence from the effect of, just being a person who is prominent in their community or identifies very strongly. And then finally, a sort of a purely, practical set of choices here. As you'll see, one of the things that we do is we go and we interview people who lived through these episodes of violence as well as their descendants. And in order to do that, we need populations of people who we can get to, where we can interview the parents or grandparents and also the children. Right, we don't have to sort of, if we were to study, say, the case of the Holocaust, right, survivors, their children, their grandchildren, many of them would be living in different countries, and we would have to be doing this across the world. So these are all cases where populations are sort of living compactly even today. Okay, so I want to just tell you a little bit about the first two cases here, and I'll leave the Cambodian cases aside for now, and I'm happy to talk about them if there are questions later on. Okay, so the first case, and this is actually the first case that we started studying, is a case of the Crimean Tatars in the mid-1940s. So this probably doesn't need to be said, but in case you are not sure where Crimea is this peninsula in the Black Sea. In 1944, so Crimea, as the rest of Ukraine, is controlled by Nazi Germany. In the early half of 1944, the Red Army, the Soviet Union and the Red Army retake Crimea from Germany. One of the first things that Stalin orders after the Red Army secures Crimea is the deportation of the Crimean Tatars. So the Crimean Tatars are a Sunni ethnic minority population in Crimea. Today they're roughly 250,000 people. In 1944 they were also roughly 250,000. Stalin orders that this population in May of 1944 be rounded up. They do this overnight and deported to Central Asia, to what is today Uzbekistan. People are rounded up and either sort of marched or put onto the backs of trucks and sent to the central train stations. They're then loaded into cattle cars, right, very similar to other situations we know about in the 1940s. The journey from Crimea to Uzbekistan, which is quite lengthy, takes roughly 4 weeks in the heat, and many Crimean Tatars die of starvation and infectious diseases. In that transportation, when they get to Uzbekistan, they are put into, what we might describe as concentration camps. Eventually, those camps grow, people have their own houses, but in fact, the Crimean Tatars live in these enclosed camps until 1989. They are not allowed to leave without permission from the Soviet authorities, including to go study at university and things like that. Gorbachev in 1989 allows them to return to Crimea, and the entire population of Crimean Tatars returns to Crimea, which creates a whole other set of politics. The estimates of how many people die in this transportation and kind of early period vary. The official Soviet record is 15% of the population. The Crimean National Movement says that 45% of the population perished. So, probably the truth is somewhere in between there. but clearly a large percentage of the population. And what's important for our study here, why this case is sort of, analytically interesting, is that everybody is put into these conditions, whether you were wealthy or poor. In fact, whether you were an officer in the Red Army, they actually forced, while the war was still going on, they forced Crimean Tatar officers in the Red Army and soldiers in the Red Army to get on the trains and go to Uzbekistan. So everybody is sort of exposed to the same violent conditions. And there's a lot of variation in who loses family members along the way, again, due to starvation or infectious diseases, but not driven by their existing political identities. Right? Okay, so that's the Crimean Tatar case. The second case I want to sort of tell you a little bit about is the case of the Ixil Maya in Guatemala. So the Ixil Maya are also an ethnic minority in Guatemala, actually sort of a similar size population, roughly 250,000 people today. The Ixil Maya, so this is one of 26 Mayan ethnicities. The Ixil Maya live in what's known as the Ixil Triangle. This is in the highlands of Guatemala, 3 municipalities that sort of form a triangle, and that's why people call it the Ixil Triangle. It's an indigenous population that sort of observes a kind of mix of Mayan and Catholic religions, and an extremely rural population. I often tell people that, and maybe it's useful to go back to the map, you can see where Guatemala City is. It takes me longer to get from Guatemala City up to the Ixil Triangle in a car than it does from Nashville to Guatemala City with a connection, because obviously we don't have direct flights to Guatemala City. So it is very remote and very rural population. And most Ixil Maya to this day don't speak Spanish. They speak Ixil Maya. In the 1970s, the beginning of the Guatemalan Civil War, the Guatemalan Civil War begins when a group of university professors and their students form a Maoist guerrilla, and they leave Guatemala City and move into the highlands in the northwest of Guatemala, sort of closer to the Mexican border, and that's where the guerrilla movement sort of begins in the early period. In the mid-1970s into the sort of later 1970s, the guerrilla leaders decide that the population that would be most amenable to being recruited to their cause would be the Ixil Maya. And one thing that's important to note is that there are longstanding stereotypes about the Ixil Maya in Guatemala, particularly among non-indigenous Guatemalans. There are sort of famous rebellions against Spanish colonialism organized by the Ixil Maya. And so they are stereotyped as being a rebellious population, right? So if you're running a guerrilla movement and that's what you think this population is like, then this is sort of fertile ground for recruiting people. So the guerrillas move into the Ixil Triangle by the late 1970s and start organizing Ixil Maya, recruiting them, sometimes coercing them into joining the guerrillas. In 1981, the Guatemalan state becomes controlled by a military junta led by Efraín Ríos Montt, who's the person here in the middle. He's eventually convicted of genocide for what he did starting in 1981 in the Ixil Triangle. He decides to pursue a scorched earth campaign against both the Ixil Maya population and the guerrillas. And the logic, and he said in an interview in 1981, a fish without water dies, a gorilla without people dies, right? So the logic was, if you get rid of the base of support of the guerrillas, you'll also be able to get rid of the guerrillas. So the army moves in and engages in burning villages and widespread massacres and genocidal violence that eventually leads to his conviction of genocide many years later. Like the Crimean Tatars, roughly 30% of the Ishil Maya population dies in this period. What's sort of important and different about the Guatemalan case relative to the Crimean Tatars is that what the army does is the army moves into this area and organizes, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through persuasion, what are called civil patrols. And those civil patrols are Ishil Maya recruits. And actually the widespread massacres and the razing of villages is mostly committed by the civil patrols under orders from the army officers. So you have army officers who are what Americans would call white, Guatemalans call them Ladino, and civil patrols who are other Ishil Maya engaging in violence against the civilian population. And this is another sort of image of the guerrillas versus the patrullas, the civil patrols engaging in this. So that's an important distinction and one that I'll come back to when I talk about some of what we've found in these cases. So let me say a little bit, now that you know something about these cases, let me say a little bit about what we did. So as I said, we went to these regions and we did extensive interviews. We started with open-ended interviews, interviewing primarily survivors from, in the Crimean case, the 1940s. At this point, this was about a decade ago, they were in their 80s. And in the Guatemalan case, people who were in their 50s. And of course, using interpreters, because neither of us speaks either Crimean Tatar or Ishil Maya. And although Leo speaks Ukrainian and Russian, I speak Spanish, among these populations, that was not necessarily useful. We followed up those interviews with surveys, more systematized, large N surveys with thousands of respondents, where we interviewed the generation that lived through the violence and then the subsequent generations who were born after the end of the violent periods. In the Crimean Tatar case, children and grandchildren, and in the Guatemalan case, the children. If you think about, what we think of when we think about doing surveys, I think, those of us who live in the US or Europe think about, online surveys or phone surveys or things like that. As you can imagine, those are not possible in these contexts. There are also no addresses. You can't sort of send people questionnaires. So we had to train members of these ethnic groups. It was important to us that the interviewers also are locals and are considered to be locals. We trained them in how to do the interviews, and we produced translated questionnaires into these local languages, which is tricky in the case of Guatemala, because Mayan is not a written language. So I can say more about that, lots more about that. So this is how we do these kinds of surveys. This is a satellite image of a village in the Ishil Triangle, and we, literally look at the rooftops of the houses and, select households to send our interviewers to. As I said, we trained co-ethnic interviewers, and that was important to us, working in the communal language. Okay, let me say, finally, a little bit about what we find. So in the Crimean Tatar case, we ask the people who lived through the deportation period how many family members they lost in that context. That's not the direct question. There's a sort of series of questions about this, right? And so that's measured by asking the people who lived through it. And then we have a series of questions about the degree to which people identify with the group, how strong their attachment is, how much they think of themselves as Crimean Tatars, how much they trust ethnic Russians or distrust ethnic Russians. And this is asked of the children and the grandchildren. And what we see is that the more family members were lost by the grandparents who lived through it, the more attached the grandchildren are to the ethnic group and the more hostile they feel towards ethnic Russians. And I should say that all of this was done prior to the invasion of Ukraine. Although just after the invasion of Crimea by Russia and the annexation in 2014. And those attachments shape the way that people think about and engage in politics. So when you ask the descendants of these victims whether or not they observe the Crimean Tatar national holiday, what their opinions are of contemporary Crimean Tatar political leaders, how they voted in the local election after Russia annexed Crimea. In all of those cases, what you see is that the grandchildren of people who lost more family members, who were exposed to more violence, are more likely to observe the holiday. They're more likely to trust their communal leaders. They are more likely to vote against the United Russia, the party of Putin, after the annexation. Now, the sort of comparison between the cases becomes important here because we don't see the same things among the Ishiel Maya, right? And that goes back to this issue of sometimes. There are these legacies sometimes, right? So when we have information about the survivors' exposure to violence from the civil patrols, right, from other Ishiel Maya, we don't see effects on group attachment with the Ishiel Maya group and hostility towards the perpetrating group, the outgroup, right, the Ladinos or whites among the descendants, right? And here it's just parents and children because this is a more recent case. But even among the Ishiel Maya, where we do see these kinds of legacies, is when people tell us that family members were arrested and tortured. And this was also sort of done in a very indiscriminate way by the civil patrols, but then the prisons were run by army officers, and those individuals were Ladinos, right? So people who were exposed to torture were exposed to a violence that was perpetrated by the ethnic outgroup. And there you do see effects. You do see that the descendants have these stronger group attachments and greater hostility towards Ladinos. And again, that permeates the way that they behave in politics and think about politics. There's a genocide day that is commemorated by the Ishiel Maya. They're more likely to do that if family members of their parents were tortured. There's a set of Ishiel political institutions. In general, most Mayan communities have a kind of parallel political system at the local level to the official Guatemalan state. They're more likely to support those Ishiel institutions, and they're more likely to distrust the Guatemalan state, right? Again, the more family members they had who were, or comparing those who had family members who were tortured to those who weren't. So again, what we're trying to show with these studies is that political violence does leave these lasting legacies, does have effects on how people think about politics to this day, not just in these cases, but more generally, but that it's not always the case, right? And there are conditions under which we see those kinds of legacies take shape, and other contexts where we wouldn't expect to see those kinds of legacies take shape. And I should say that we focus on a couple of things that we think matter a lot: the ethnic targeting and the sense of who is perpetrating this. But there are presumably lots of other things that also matter for this, the post-conflict setting, and one could imagine lots of things. I think, what we're trying to do is kind of open the box for studying this much more generally. As I said, people are political scientists are more and more studying the kind of legacies part, but not so much the conditions under which we tend to see it. And then, as I said, this kind of individual experience versus the grand narrative. It turns out Efraín Ríos Montt, the dictator in charge of the Scorched Earth campaign after the end of the Guatamalan Civil War in the mid-1990s, runs for president of Guatemala, forms a political party and runs for president. One of the places where he does best in that election, which he loses, is the Ixil Triangle. And people find this incredibly puzzling, right? Because here is the sort of perpetrator and this community of victims. But what we think is really important to note in this case, and we think it applies much more generally, is that that's not how people experienced the violence, right? The vast majority of the violence was committed by the civil patrols and not by the army. And to the extent that Ríos Montt is sort of, considered to be the person who won the war, right, who ended the Civil War, he's very much supported among this community that felt like they were most hard hit by the conflict itself, right? They don't view him as the perpetrator in charge who is sort of, responsible for the violence that they experienced, right? So the individual perception can be very different from the way that we talk about these conflicts, and that's what I'm sort of labeling here as the grand narrative. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and reactions. Yeah, Johannes. And yes, you know to wait for the mic.
Thanks, Noam. That's fascinating research. I'm struck by the fact that the way you approach it is ultimately around the politics of identity. Mm-hmm. My first question is whether you'd agree with that framing, and if that is true, I wonder what kind of alternative explanations or control groups you would pursue, in the sense, I mean, that's not my language, but I'm trying to say.
It's mine, I guess. Yeah.
Maybe I don't want to impute it to you either. So, but what I'm thinking, certain theories about cultural backlash today that have to do with modernization, the feeling of dissipating identities, pluralization, diversification, etc., which could lead to similar outcomes, that a group will identify more cohesively, or will reassert forms of identity, or will invent new traditions, however you want to phrase that. So I'm just curious whether that's an issue at all for the way you frame the research, and how you think about, if you think explicitly about identity as a political category, how you, from your disciplinary perspective, how you think about that.
Yeah, I guess that last part is a pretty big a pretty big undertaking. But I think we have a very kind of, and I think most political scientists, a very sort of constructivist view of political identities. So, political identity is something that is kind of socialized and formed, based on sort of contexts. And that's precisely why trauma produces a kind of need for security and a need to retreat into some sort of identity. One of the things that I think we try to argue is that ethnic identity is a really easy place to go in a sort of context of retreating to some sort of securing identity or sort of sense of community, in part because it's typically something that's easy to identify, right? So either phenotypically through race or language, or right, there's a built-in sense of community, and there's a way to be able to tell whether you're an in-group or an out-group member, right? And so that provides the basis, I think, for how we think about this. The question about whether these other factors that shape identity matter is an important one, because it's sort of built into the way that we try to study this. So we didn't do what you were sort of describing, which is, well, let's study the Crimean Tatars and let's find some control group, right, that is sort of like them but wasn't deported, right, didn't experience this violence. We decided that that's very difficult to do and implausible to find a group. There are other sort of ethnic Tatar groups in Turkey and in Russia, and we did sort of think about this. But part of the issue with doing that precisely is that there's so many other communal factors that matter after the violence, during the violence, that it would just be sort of not very credible. And so what we're studying really is, among the victimized group, differences in sort of levels of victimization, or sort of, you can think about it as sort of how much violence people are exposed to within the family, who loses who, and we sort of go through the questionnaire goes through like the entire family sort of history with the survivors, and that, I think, helps us sort of distinguish that from these other things at the communal level that are, obviously happening and shaping people's political identities, but we are sort of setting those aside and saying, what is the sort of effect that the violence itself is having? Yeah, over here.
I'll give
That's
it to
fine.
you.
Yeah, we'll go down this way.
That's right. My question relates to what it actually means to address violence in the long term through means of transitional justice. Did you find a change in attitude when Rios Mott was convicted in 2013? And then there was also the opening of the National Police Archive and all these ideas of addressing it and finding accountability. I can understand that violence is associated with the in-group, and that's why the long-term effect of that, at least, or the short-term effect in the mid-90s was not as bad. But is there an intervening variable in the long term, or what does that mean for all transitional justice measurements? Is the original experience of violence so overall determining my long-term identification with what happened? And then in the comparison between the Crimean Tatars, there was never accountability there. Yeah. Does that also change a long-term effect of identification and political violence, and how that continues in the post-violence situation? One might argue that the Soviet Union was never really quite post-violent or repression, but different things.
Yeah. Just on that last the post. So everyone who's a grandchild was born in independent Ukraine, post-Soviet, right? So by the time we were doing this, it's all post-Soviet. And in the Cambodian case, there is also very little transitional justice. There's sort of a couple of high-profile cases, but in general, very little. Ishiel Maya had no idea that Rios Mott had been convicted. And almost nobody had any idea about the Truth and Reconciliation reports that were done by the Catholic Church and by the opening of the archives. I mean, it is a population that is very, distant and detached, but also there was just really no information disseminated. We did interview one woman who was a witness in the trials, and it was remarkable how, she was clearly trained by the lawyers who, prepared her for the trial. It was remarkable how different her interview went, right? We sort of asked one question, and then there were paragraphs and paragraphs of description. And many of the other interviews, you know, people in rural communities, they give you a one-sentence answer, and then, you know, you have to sort of keep asking questions. But that was extremely rare. I mean, that was sort of the exception to all the others. So my sense in all of these cases is that in people's perceptions, there is very little that has happened post-conflict in terms of transitional justice. And, you know, that sort of analytically allows us, I think, to make those comparisons. But it also means that, you know, we can't really speak to, if there is a concerted sort of, you know, transitional justice process, you know, what does that look like? Does that sort of temper, attenuate some of these effects of the violence? Yeah. Yeah, so there's another, yeah.
So I think I want to ask, because you mentioned that there are other groups of Tatars in Turkey, and I was just wondering if there is any kind of connection between an affected ethnic group and the sense of identification and stronger identification with that kind of ethnic group from some other parts of the world that weren't directly affected by that, but that was still have some kind of a identity link to the Crimean Tatars, if that's something that you looked into, or if that's kind of a connection that you can make.
So for the most part, so there are other ethnic Tatar communities. They don't really think of themselves as related, and you know, in a sort of genetic sense, they really aren't. But for the most part, the other Tatar groups don't think of themselves, and that was, you know, partly kind of precluded thinking about kind of studying them as comparisons. In some of the others, we study in Cambodia the Cham, which is another ethnic Sunni population there, and they have some ethnic relationship to Malays. Yeah, it could be that, you know, this affects sort of, you know, those related communities in some way. But I think, again, that would be kind of a community level story, right? It's not about people's individual experiences, but about kind of the narrative that an ethnic community sort of tells about itself and its history. And here, you know, we're really, what we're trying to focus on really is that individual level variation and sort of, you know, who identifies more and how that plays out. Thanks. I think Mark had a, yeah. Oh, you want to go there? Whatever's closer. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have two quick questions. One kind of on the contact hypothesis and one on desirability bias. The first of which is these communities are both very isolated. After the atrocities happen, they remain isolated for a very long time. And then, you know, eventually you survey them a couple generations later. How important is this isolation, right? If this group had had contact to the perpetrating group, you know, over generations and had gone to school with them, would that have watered down the effect? And how does that speak to, say, generalizability of the claim? Mm-hmm. And the second question is about the use of co-ethnics as interviewers. Mm-hmm. And, you know, a very common phenomenon in surveys is desirability bias, in which very often respondents give the response that they think the interviewer wants to hear. Mm-hmm. Is this something that you tried varying, or is it something that you potentially could vary? Because, for example, in Guatemala, you maybe, I don't know how well they remember the families of who was in the patrol and who was in the guerrillas, then maybe you could randomize interviewers from those two different groups to see if you get a different result.
Yeah, that turns out to be extremely sensitive, and obviously nobody wants to admit that they were involved in the civil patrols or that family members were involved. There's a lot of sort of pieces of this that, you know, became too sensitive to ask about, and some of those things we have to bracket. But I think the issue would be for the way that we're studying this. So we find that people whose parents were exposed to had family members exposed to more violence through family member experiences or their own exhibit these kind of stronger group identities. If they're doing that, right, so everybody is sort of co-ethnic, but those people are expressing kind of a higher attachment to the group. They're doing that because of a desirability bias, then that desirability bias is higher for them for some reason, right? So there's still, I think, a sort of effect of the violence in sort of, what you think group members think and what you think group members think you should say, and that, in some sense is kind of the same thing, that there is this kind of stronger concern about the group and your kind of place within it, which is really sort of what we think about in terms of identity. It's this groupness idea. I forgot your first question. Oh, yes. Yeah, so they're not, maybe I overstated kind of the ruralness because it feels so hard to get there, but they're not isolated from the out-group. So certainly the Crimean Tatars live in villages with ethnic Ukrainians or ethnic Russians. It's actually not all that different ethnic groups, even though today that has become more salient to people.
1989 they
didn't, right? So everybody who is a grandchild in this survey grew up in independent Ukraine, sort of going to school with ethnic Ukrainians. I mean, there's contact throughout, and that's true for the Ishiel Maya too. In the sort of very, very highlands, there are maybe Ishiel Maya villages, but mostly they are interspersed with Ladinos and what they would call Creoles. So right, people who are descended from Ladinos and Ishiel Maya. So I don't think it's a sort of issue of lack of contact in these cases, which might suggest that if there is an isolated case, that might look different. But yeah, we don't have variation on that. I think they're all fairly integrated. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It's really interesting. I have two questions, a little bit related to what Mark said. First, why did you decide on these two particular groups, the Ishiel Maya and the Crimean Tatars? And was it partly because you felt they've been maybe under-researched, let's say, as opposed to Armenians, where I would assume there's a sort of big body of work? And then my second question is, was your interest in the Ishiel Maya related to the fact that it was their own people, or mostly their own people, who perpetrated these atrocities, which I suppose is unusual, right? I mean, in most other cases, it's a different ethnic group, which in some ways I would assume makes it easier to digest.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that... Yeah, I don't know about easier to digest, but it does, I think, precisely sort of generate different kinds of effects when it is kind of inter-ethnic in this way, but also importantly perceived as inter-ethnic, because in fact the Guatemalan context is inter-ethnic. It was not experienced that way. I don't actually think it's all that unusual. So we also look at the Khmer, which is the ethnic majority in Cambodia, and even though during the Khmer Rouge period, and even though the Khmer Rouge regime was extremely racist towards a variety of groups, the Cham, who we also study, but ethnic Chinese, ethnic Vietnamese, there isn't this kind of inter-ethnic sense among the ethnic Khmer, right? So people were collectivized. 20% of the population died of starvation, or were sort of executed as a punishment for stealing food in the context of a lack of food. And in that context as well, you don't see those same kinds of effects where you don't have that group identity sort of triggering the identity reaction to violence. So I don't think those are isolated cases. I think there's lots of cases of violence that is not intercommunal, or even cases like the Guatemalan case where in a sort of grand sense it is intercommunal, but at the very local level it's not experienced that way, and it is very much neighbor against neighbor. Again, Wendelin, I forgot your first question. Yeah.
Why you picked those two groups, and was it partly because they were maybe under-researched as opposed to other types of political violence?
Yeah, I mean, another requirement, and you mentioned the Armenian case. I mean, again, there are so many, unfortunately, so many cases that one could pick, and there's a sort of feasibility issues with some of them. But the Armenian case is too far back for us to interview survivors, right? And so it was important to us that the report of violence that the ancestors, the victims, the survivors who experience it, are exposed to is reported to us by the people who lived through it, and not by the same descendants who are then reporting that they identify strongly with the group, right? Because then you might be worried about the kinds of things that Mark worries about, right? That people are going to report things in kind of skewed ways. We did actually ask those questions in the Crimean Tatar case, and what the descendants thought the grandchildren thought their grandparents' experiences were actually varies tremendously from what the grandparents actually told us. So we're trying not to rely on that. So like the Armenian case would be a difficult one. It's just too far back in history. So there are all these kind of practical considerations, and really we're interested in, among the cases where we could do this, looking at some of this variation in the ethnic targeting and the intercommunal violence. Yes, Sarah. Oh, you got to wait for the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
rules.
Noam, for the talk and the project. So I have two questions. One is somewhat related, and it's why you chose to focus on ethnic groups as opposed to racial or religious or national group or political group, for example. And the second question is more about the implications of the project. So as an international criminal lawyer, the two crimes that stand out to me in relation to your project are genocide and persecution-based crimes against humanity, which are two crimes that are focused on perpetration of the crime based on identity. And what you're talking about here is the experience of the victims being different because of their identity. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on sort of the implications of the differential experiences of victim groups based on how they think about the relationship of their particular identity to the crimes that have been experienced by their family members. Sort of whether you think that the experience of victimization might be as important as the experience of targeting based on perpetration, for example, right? So we think about these crimes through the lens of the perpetrator targeting. Should we be thinking about them also through the experience of the victim as identity-based targeting, regardless of what the perpetrator is intending?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a question for you, I think. Yeah, I think what we want to point out is that those things can be very different, and that the intent of the perpetrator doesn't always translate into the experience of the victim, and that's just not how people experience it or kind of internalize the reason that they experienced, were exposed to some kind of violence. Whether that yeah, whether that shapes sort of how we should think about it legally, I don't know. I think I leave that to you. So when I think about ethnicity, I sort of think of ethnicity as a broad category that includes race, nationality, language, religion, yeah, all of those things. In many of these cases, those things overlap in lots of ways. So the Crimean Tatars have a Crimean Tatar language. There's it's an ethnic group. They're also a religious minority because they're Muslim in a predominantly Russian Orthodox majority. In Guatemala, maybe a little bit less of a religious minority because in fact the indigenous population is majority in Guatemala, but they are sort of a mix of Mayan and Catholic, but certainly racially minority and language minority. So I think it's a mix of those things, and we haven't sort of thought about differentiating them. We're kind of including all of that. The last one. Okay, so. What? Yeah? Okay. So there's one question in the back. We can start there.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering what your view is on how this intergenerational trauma carries on across different generations, or in other words, how quickly it subsides, and also related to that, what in your view are the most effective categories of interventions that could reduce that more quickly, this impact? Perhaps, is there any data that could perhaps even support this?
Yeah. Those are great questions, kind of the million-dollar questions. The first one is easy to answer, at least in our data. By the third generation, the effect, that is the degree to which increased or additional exposure to violence by the person who lived through it affects the identity, attachment, and hostility to the outgroup, sort of declines by about a third by the third generation. Okay, so it is getting attenuated. Now, you would sort of expect that because, of course, even if people are marrying within the ethnic group, there's sort of the heterogeneity of experience is becoming sort of less and less varied, unless people are kind of gravitating towards the descendants of people who were more victimized. But otherwise, you're sort of dissipating the effect even by that. So it declines by about a third over the three generations. And it's, we see the sort of same pattern, even though we have two generations in Cambodia and in Guatemala. The interventions question really depends on what you think is the mechanism of transmission of these identities. We're sort of calling that socialization. There's a lot of study of socialization in sociology in particular, and there's so many ways that parents socialize their children into identities. In the film, Mindy talks about silence of survivors. There's a lot of work in psychology on that in the case of Holocaust survivors, that the transmission of these things wasn't something that was the result of sort of discussion and kind of active transmission, but was actually the result of an effort. And Mel Rubel, one of the survivors who has the two grown children sort of sitting next to him, talks about not wanting to talk about it with his children, but of course that generates the, many of the same effects, the same kind of trauma of not understanding and sort of knowing that there's something that you can't talk about. Mindy talks about that similar to alcoholism. So, if that's the right mechanism, then a possible intervention would be to have more discussion of those things. we actually ask in our surveys how much the family discussed what they went through. And the families that discussed what they went through more are the families where these effects are highest. Now, you know, what drives people to talk about it versus not talk about it, right? I think there's still a lot of questions about, you know, what that means. It gets to the question of sort of transitional justice. Or if you bring these things out into the open, does that reduce the kind of intergroup hostility or increase the intergroup hostility? You know, I think empirically we really don't know at the kind of social level what the effects are, and you know, it really depends on measuring these kinds of mechanisms in more and more cases, I think. Dan.
So, Noam, thanks for a fascinating talk on a fascinating subject. So you have spoken about, you know, the behaviors post-violence, and the question I have is whether there might not be some explanatory utility in the identity before the violence, which is to say that I don't know anything about the Ishmael Mayans, and I'm man enough to say it, but the Crimean Tatars, as you just pointed out, had centuries of experience as an ethnic minority in a sea of some often hostile orthodoxy. Again, I don't want to. The last thing I want to do is be woefully politically incorrect by suggesting that group identities are also constructed differently, maybe in Europe from the way they are among indigenous peoples in Latin America. And so I'm wondering if, in fact, the inherited notion of the group in the group affected isn't a variable that somehow needs to be taken into account.
Yeah, so we did ask a long series of questions about people's experiences prior to the conflict. Now, you know, all of that is reported to us, you know, decades later, but it is what we have. You know, we tried to get at the kinds of things that would lead people to identify with a group or not identify with a group, and, you know, whether their family was sort of religious leaders or particularly affluent or political leaders, or there's all sorts of questions to get at that. And none of that seems to be kind of driving these effects. It really seems to be the experience of the violence, at least, you know, in the data that we have. Now, you know, the more kind of constructivist question about whether identity is constructed differently in some places than in others, I think, you know, almost certainly the answer to that is yes. But part of the sort of effort of doing all these interviews prior to fielding a big survey was to try to figure out, you know, how does this group think about their group identity? What kinds of questions could we ask to measure those things? And those questions are different in the different cases because they're simply, you know, different contexts. We ask people about, you know, we want to know how religious they are and how religious their family was before the violence. Religiosity for, you know, Crimean Tatars looks very different from religiosity for the Ishmael Maya, right? So it is tailored to try to address those kinds of differences, but you know, to the extent that we can, I guess.
I think you need Clifford Geertz to join your team.
Yes, yeah. Yes, there's a question here.
This is a quick anecdote, and maybe a question. In the 80s, I was in Russia when it was the Soviet Union, and met with Andrei Sakharov in 1987. He had a real passionate interest in the Crimean Tatars. A lot of the human rights people didn't. And in 1989, a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had a delegation from the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights with Russian lawyers, judges, whatever. We held aside a day for a meeting with Sakharov and the Crimean Tatars. We reserved a big room. We're there are 40 of them. And we waited for an hour and he didn't show up. He died that day. And it became the memorial to Sakharov, spontaneous. Several hundred people showed up. Mm-hmm. And there was a great resonance with this Crimean Tatar group that he was the one human rights person that really paid attention to them. Yeah. Maybe there's a question, this is before all your interviews. One, did they know anything about Sakharov? Did they regard him as one of their heroes? And this notion that somehow human rights movements have a harder time with groups that are outside of their ethnicity or their, I see that with the Chinese and the Tibetans, tensions between the mainstream human rights groups. And again, with the Russians as well. Elena Bonner was concerned about refuseniks, about dissidents. Andrei Sakharov cared about the Crimean Tatars.
Yeah, I think that's fairly unusual. I mean, in across certainly these cases, especially when we're looking at small ethnic minority groups that are targeted, there are very few people who advocate for these groups outside of the group. Of course, the Crimean Tatars had a national movement that actually predates the deportation. And historically there was a Crimean Tatar kingdom briefly in Crimea, and there is this kind of movement to create a national homeland in Crimea. This is part of Stalin's justification for deporting the Crimean Tatars to Uzbekistan. The others, for the most part, don't have those kinds of political aspirations, but the advocates among these groups, I think, tend to be members of the group rather than outside. Yeah.
Did they know he was on their side? Did any of the people you talked to?
No, I mean, we did our interviews in Crimea in 2014, right after the annexation, and I don't think his name ever came up. No, yeah, only the names that came up were leaders within the group, the political leaders within the group, and the famous nationalist movement leader from the 60s who was imprisoned in Moscow for decades. Yeah. Oh. Yes. In the front.
So I was wondering about the like political thing that you mentioned about when Gorbachev decided to let them go back to Crimea.
Yeah.
I was wondering what that was.
Yeah, I think it was part of Gorbachev's sort of policy to open up the Soviet Union and to be seen to address some of the human rights violations. That was a long-standing human rights violation. So he, opens up the ability for them to return. And then by the time the Soviet Union collapses, some have not returned, but by the end of the 1990s, they all go back to Crimea, which is pretty remarkable, I think. I mean, some people had married Uzbeks, but they all go back to Crimea. And of course, that generates a political situation with reclaiming property and, other kinds of issues once they get there. That's it? Yeah. Thank you.